The rancher was mending a broken fence when he heard it, the faintest voice, small and trembling. He turned, and there she was. A little girl no older than 8, barefoot, her dress torn to rags. She held a tiny bundle, all she owned in the world, and her eyes were red from crying. "My mama died today," she whispered, her voice cracking in the dry wind. "Can I stay with you, mister?" The rancher froze, his hand still on the fence post. He hadn't spoken to a soul in weeks, hadn't smiled in years. Something inside him broke wide open. He knelt down, tipped his hat, and said softly, "You can stay forever." And from that moment on, neither of them was alone again. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The wind had died down by the time Caleb Rawlins carried the little girl inside, but the chill of the plains clung to her like a second skin, her small body trembling against his arm as if she feared even the warmth might break her. The cabin was old and plain, its timbers warped by years of sun and loneliness, but it was shelter, and he did what little he knew to make it welcoming. He stoked the fire until the light filled every shadowed corner, pulled a wool blanket from his bunk, and wrapped it around her shoulders. She sat stiffly at first, her wide eyes flicking from the flicker of flame to his rough hands, as though unsure if this was safety or just another kind of danger. "You hungry?" he asked, his voice low, unused to company. She nodded once, and he ladled her a bowl of beans from the pot that had been simmering since dawn. When she ate, it was with the quiet desperation of someone who hadn't trusted a meal in days. Caleb sat across from her at the table, his calloused fingers tracing the rim of his coffee mug as he tried to think of what to say. It had been years since he'd shared a meal with anyone, years since laughter or talk had filled this cabin, and now here was this child, small, alone, her face streaked with the kind of dirt that comes from more than just dust. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft he almost missed it. "Mama said we'd find a place where kindness still lives," she murmured, staring into the fire. "We didn't find it. She got sick on the trail. I tried to help, but she got cold and wouldn't wake up, so I walked. I just kept walking." Her tiny hands tightened around the bowl, and Caleb felt something inside him twist until it hurt to breathe. He'd buried too many good things in this life, his wife, his son, his hope that anything worth saving could be saved, but this child's words struck a place he'd thought long dead. "Ain't no easy thing," he said quietly, "losing someone like that." She looked up at him then, and for the first time he saw her properly, those eyes. Too old for her face. The mix of fear and stubbornness that reminded him of the woman he'd once loved. "You got a name, little one?" he asked. "Annie," she whispered. "Annie Mae." "Well, Annie Mae," he said, standing slowly and setting his hat on the peg by the door. "Reckon this place ain't much, but it'll keep the wind off and the fire warm. You can stay here till you're ready to move on." She blinked at him, confusion flickering across her small, dirt-smudged face. "Move on where?" The question stopped him cold, because he didn't have an answer. He just nodded, his throat too tight to trust words. When she finished eating, she curled up by the fire, her bundle of belongings clutched tight to her chest, a doll missing an arm, a tin locket, a threadbare ribbon. Within minutes, she was asleep, her breath shallow but even. Caleb watched her for a long time, the fire crackling between them, and in that silence he felt her mother's promise settle over him like a weight and a calling both. Find a place where kindness still lives. He looked around at the cabin, at the empty chair across from his own, and realized maybe that place wasn't something you found, it was something you made. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and dark, but for the first time in years, the light inside his home burned steady through the night. For years, the old cabin had known only silence, the kind that seeps into the bones of a place until it forgets what laughter sounds like, until even the wind through the eaves feels like mourning. Caleb Rawlins had lived with that silence so long it had become part of him, as familiar as the creak of his boots or the ache in his knees each morning. After his wife, Ruth, and their boy, Thomas, had taken fever and gone within days of each other, he'd stopped speaking to anyone but the cattle and the empty sky. And even that had felt like too much sometimes. He'd stopped tending the flowers Ruth had planted by the window, stopped patching the roof, stopped believing in the notion of home. But now the air inside his house was different. It wasn't loud, not by any measure, but it carried something fragile and alive. The faint clink of a spoon against a tin bowl, the soft hum of a lullaby that drifted from the hearth as the little girl, Annie, tried to remember the words her mother used to sing. The sound filled the space between the walls in a way the fire alone never could. Caleb sat at the table pretending to mend tack, though his hands had stilled long ago. He listened to her small, uneven voice and found himself staring into the flame, his heart doing something it hadn't done in years. It ached, not from loss, but from remembering what it felt like to have someone else breathing under his roof. When she finally drifted off to sleep beside the fire, curled beneath one of his old wool blankets, he rose quietly and draped another quilt over her, the same one Ruth had stitched back when their boy was still toddling around her skirts. His hand hovered above Annie's head for a moment before he drew it back, unsure if he had the right to offer such tenderness. She stirred in her sleep, murmuring something about her mama, and he felt the sound of it cut clean through the crust that grief had built around his heart. He stepped outside then, needing the cold, night air to steady himself. The prairie stretched endless and silver under the moon, the fence line he'd mended earlier that day running straight as a scar across the land. Somewhere out there, coyotes yipped, and an owl called from the sycamores. It should have felt lonely, the same way it always did, but it didn't, not tonight. When he turned back to the cabin, the light from the fire spilled through the window like a promise he didn't remember making. He went to the barn to check the horses, not because they needed checking, but because he wasn't ready to admit how much that small warmth inside scared him. It wasn't just the girl's presence. It was what it stirred memories of Ruth's laughter echoing against those same walls, of Thomas begging to be lifted to the saddle, of a life he'd buried but never stopped missing. By the time he returned inside, the embers had burned low, and the child was still sleeping, her tiny hand clutching that ragged doll as though it tethered her to the world. Caleb stood there a long while, watching her chest rise and fall, and realized that the silence he'd been living in wasn't peace, it was absence. And maybe, just maybe, this little girl hadn't come to be saved by him at all. Maybe she'd come to save what was left of him. As he sat down in his old chair by the fire, the cabin seemed to breathe again. The kind of quiet that isn't empty but full, the kind that sounds a lot like a heart remembering how to beat. The sun was barely up when Caleb hitched his wagon and set out for town, the morning light spilling over the plains in long, golden bands that promised warmth but carried a chill beneath. Annie sat beside him on the seat, her small frame swallowed by one of his old coats, the sleeves rolled and pinned so they wouldn't drag. She'd been quiet the whole ride, her wide eyes fixed on the endless stretch of dirt road ahead, her little hands gripping the bundle of coins he'd given her as if they were treasure. It had been months since he'd last gone to town, long enough that his absence had probably turned into something worth gossiping over. And sure enough, when the wagon wheels crunched to a stop outside the general store, the stares began. Folks on the boardwalk paused mid-conversation, their voices dipping low as he lifted Annie down. "That ain't his young'un," someone muttered near the feed barrels. "He's been alone since his wife passed." Another voice, sharper, full of the kind of curiosity that hides cruelty. "Heard he found her out on the trail. Bet he's keeping her for the work." Caleb kept his face set, his jaw tight, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him react. He'd spent too long building walls thick enough to keep out the world's noise, and he wasn't about to let the likes of them shake him now. Inside the store, the air was thick with dust and spice, the scent of tobacco mingling with coffee grounds and grain. Annie stayed close, her small hand clutching his coat, eyes darting nervously toward every sound. "Don't mind them," he said gruffly, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "Townfolk like talking more than listening." She nodded, though he could see the way her mouth trembled at the corners. He made his way down the aisles, gathering what they needed: flour, salt, candles, a new bridle for the mare, but paused when they passed a row of dresses hanging behind the counter. Most plain cotton, the kind meant for work, but one caught her eye. Pale blue, simple, trimmed with a bit of white lace along the collar. She didn't touch it, just looked at it the way a hungry child looks at bread. Caleb followed her gaze, then cleared his throat. "You like that one?" She startled, blinking up at him. "It's pretty," she said softly, as if afraid of wanting too much. He set the supplies on the counter, the storekeeper raising an eyebrow but saying nothing, then nodded toward the dress. Add that and a ribbon too. Red, maybe. Annie's eyes went wide, disbelief flashing into something brighter. For me? Don't see anyone else it'd fit, he said, pretending to study the rows of canned beans. When she smiled, really smiled, it caught him off guard. So sudden and pure it felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. It was the first time he'd seen her face without the weight of fear pulling it down, and it did something to him he couldn't name. The whispers were louder when they left the store. The same bitter voices that always trailed behind kindness in a place that had forgotten the word. Old fool, one man muttered. He'll regret taking in strays. Caleb ignored him, helping Annie onto the wagon, handing her the small brown package tied with twine. She unwrapped it slowly, the blue fabric spilling over her hands like water, the red ribbon shining in the sunday. Thank you, mister, she said, her voice trembling with something like joy. You can call me Caleb, he said quietly. You're not a stranger here. As they rode back toward the ridge, the wind tugged at her ribbon and carried her laughter through the open air, small, fleeting, but real. For the first time in years, he found himself smiling too, the sound of it foreign but welcome. A reminder that sometimes the best kind of defiance against a cruel world was to be kind anyway. The morning Caleb walked Annie up the hill to the little white schoolhouse. The sky was bright and clear, the kind of morning that smelled of promise and new beginnings. But by sundown that same sky felt heavy, pressing down on his cabin like a weight. He'd wanted her to have something better than the life he'd known, a chance to learn, to laugh with other children, to grow without the ghosts that haunted his own childhood. But the world, as he'd learned long ago, didn't always have room for goodness. The teacher, a kind woman named Miss Harland, had smiled politely when he brought Annie in, saying she'd be glad to have her. But even Caleb could feel the eyes of the other children prickling at the back of his neck. He'd seen it before, how small towns loved their gossip more than truth, how they whispered stories until even the innocent began to wear shame they didn't deserve. When he left her that morning, she'd stood tall as she could, her new blue dress clean and the red ribbon bright in her hair, trying her best to be brave. But when the door to the cabin burst open that afternoon and she stumbled inside, her face streaked with tears, he knew what had happened before she could speak. She dropped her slate and books, the chalk shattering like bone on the floor. They called me names, she gasped between sobs. Said I'm nobody's real child. Said you just took me 'cause you were lonely. Said my mama didn't want me. Each word hit him like a blow, and for a long time he didn't move. Anger burned slow in his chest, not the wild kind that lashes out, but the deep, old kind that had been sleeping too long. He crouched down beside her, his rough hand hovering near her shoulder, unsure if she'd want the comfort. You listen to me, Annie Mae, he said finally, his voice steady but thick. Ain't a soul in this world got the right to tell you who you are. Not them, not me, not anyone. She sniffled, wiping at her eyes with her sleeve. But they laughed, Caleb. Said I didn't belong. He leaned back, the firelight carving lines into his weathered face. I know that feeling, he said softly. When I was your age, I worked the fields from dawn till night, eatin' dust and dreamin' of more. Folks laughed then too. Said a boy like me wouldn't amount to much. Didn't have a name worth rememberin'. But I built this life from dirt, Annie. From dust and sweat and stubbornness. And every man who ever spat my name learned that I wasn't made to be small. His words hung in the air, steady and heavy as the crackle of the fire. Annie looked up at him then, her tear-streaked face shining in the glow, her eyes searching his for something she could hold on to. How'd you do it? She asked, her voice no louder than a whisper. Caleb smiled faintly, though it was the kind that carried sorrow with it. By standin' tall even when the wind tried to knock me down, he said. By rememberin' that worth ain't something anyone else can give you. It's something you decide to have. She stared at the flames for a long while, her small hands fisting in her lap as if trying to hold the strength he offered. Finally, she nodded once, slow but sure. I'll go back tomorrow, she said. Good, he replied, leaning back in his chair. And when they say you don't belong, you tell 'em this. I belong anywhere kindness lives. Her lips twitched, almost a smile, and before long she was curled up by the fire, her ribbon still in her hair, her chin resting on her knees. Caleb watched her drift to sleep, pride and sorrow warring quietly in his chest. He knew the world wouldn't change overnight, but maybe, just maybe, the girl would learn to stand taller than the cruelty that tried to cut her down. And for a man who'd thought his life was long over, that small, stubborn light felt like the start of something worth living for. The first snow came early that year, quiet and soft, a dusting of white across the ridges that seemed harmless enough. But by the third night, the storm had turned savage, swallowing the valley whole. The wind screamed down from the mountains like a living thing, tearing at the shutters, rattling the chimney until even the fire seemed to shrink back from its fury. Caleb Rawlins had seen harsh winters before, enough to know what hunger and cold could do to a soul, but this one felt different, crueler somehow, as if the world itself were testing what little he had left. For days, he and Annie kept to the cabin, rationing what they could: a few sacks of flour, half a barrel of oats, some jerky he'd cured in the fall. He'd wrapped the windows in canvas, stuffed rags beneath the door, and kept the fire burning through the night. But even then the chill crept in through the cracks, biting at their skin and breath alike. Annie tried to be brave, she always did, but by the fifth morning her small voice had gone thin, her hands too cold to hold the cup of broth he offered. When the fever came, it came fast, burning bright and merciless, leaving her trembling under the quilts, her cheeks flushed scarlet against skin gone pale. Caleb sat beside her, helpless, the memory of another fever clawing its way out of the past Ruth's ragged breathing. Thomas's small hand slipping from his. He'd sworn to himself that he would never beg again after burying them, that prayer was just another form of false hope. But now, with Annie's tiny frame twisting in pain, her lips whispering nonsense through the haze, he found himself on his knees by the bed, his rough hands clutching hers as though his grip alone could anchor her to the world. "Don't you go," he muttered, his voice breaking. "You hear me, Annie Mae? Don't you dare leave me too." He didn't sleep, not once. The nights blurred into one another, each hour stretching thin, marked only by the rhythm of her shallow breaths and the hiss of the wind clawing at the door. He fed the fire, wiped her brow, whispered stories half remembered from long ago, anything to keep her tethered to the sound of a living voice. The days passed, like years. When he finally stumbled to his feet to fetch more wood, his hands shook so bad he dropped half the logs before making it back inside. He sat again by her bedside, too weak to do more than watch. Her fever had broken into sweat, but she was still so still it near tore his heart out. He rested his head against the quilt and whispered one last plea to a heaven he wasn't sure could hear him. "If you've got any mercy left, don't take her. Not her." And then, just as the dawn broke pale through the frost-bitten window, he felt the faintest tug at his sleeve. He lifted his head, and there she was, eyes open, glassy but aware, her lips cracked and dry as she tried to form words. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice so soft it might have been the wind itself. For a moment, Caleb couldn't breathe. Then it hit him all at once, the relief, the exhaustion, the gratitude he'd forgotten how to feel, and before he could stop himself, he broke. The tears came hot and unstoppable, years of buried grief spilling out in rough sobs that shook his whole frame. He caught her small hand in his and pressed it to his cheek, whispering her name over and over like a prayer finally answered. Outside, the storm was breaking, the wind easing into quiet. Inside, the fire burned low but steady, the color returning to Annie's face inch by inch. And as the first light of morning crept across the floorboards, Caleb Rawlins realized he hadn't just saved her, she'd saved him too, pulling him back from the frozen edge of a life half-lived, teaching him once again what it meant to stay when it would have been easier to give up. The snow had begun to thaw, the world softening under the first timid warmth of spring, when the sound of hooves broke the quiet peace Caleb Rawlins had come to treasure. He looked up from splitting logs, the steady rhythm of the axe falling silent as two riders crested the ridge, one in a brown duster, the other in the blue-gray coat of the county sheriff. A bad feeling settled in his gut before they even dismounted. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand and stepped toward the yard gate, the wind carrying the faint creak of leather and the jingle of tack. The older man was the first to speak, a heavy-set fellow with a worn hat and mean eyes that didn't match the smile on his face. "You Caleb Rawlins?" he asked, his voice too smooth to be trusted. Caleb nodded once. "That's me." The man tipped his hat slightly. Name's Silas Monroe. I'm this little girl's uncle." The words hit like a bullet, leaving a hollow silence in their wake. "Annie?" Caleb asked slowly, his voice low and careful, though his heart had already begun to pound. "That right?" Silas's grin widened. "Aye, Annie Mae Monroe, my sister's child. Been looking for her since her mama took sick. Poor woman, rest her soul. I reckon she's better off with family now, don't you think?" Caleb didn't answer, just crossed his arms and looked toward the cabin, where the door had cracked open and Annie stood framed in the dim light, her small hand gripping the post, her eyes wide and frightened. When she saw the man, she shrank back, shaking her head. "That ain't my uncle," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mama said to stay away from him." The sheriff, a tall man with weathered features and a badge dulled from years of wear, glanced between them, frowning. "Mr. Monroe's got papers," he said, reaching into his coat. "Claims guardianship of the girl. Says she's been taken without consent." Caleb's stomach turned cold. He took the papers, scanning the neat, official-looking print. But his eyes caught on the signature. It wasn't the name of Annie's mother. He looked up sharply. "This ain't right," he said. "Her mama never mentioned kin, and this paper's forged, I'd wager." The sheriff sighed, clearly uncomfortable. "Maybe. Maybe not. But I'm bound by law to see this matter settled proper. You've got till sundown tomorrow, Rollins. Either bring the girl into town or I come take her myself." Silas smirked, adjusting his gloves. "Best not make it harder than it has to be, mister. The law don't take kindly to folks harboring stolen children." "She ain't stolen," Caleb said, his voice a growl now, though his body stayed still. "She came to me, alone, dying." Silas only shrugged. "That's for the sheriff to sort." They mounted up, the sheriff giving him one last look that wasn't unkind, just tired, as if he'd seen too many of these things go bad. When the hoofbeats faded, Caleb turned back to the cabin. Annie had already run to him, clutching his coat so tight he could feel her fingers tremble through the fabric. "Please don't let him take me," she cried, her words broken and desperate. "Mama said he'd hurt me if he found me. Please, Caleb." He knelt down, his hands gripping her shoulders, heart twisting at the sheer terror in her face. "I ain't letting nobody hurt you," he said, the words low but fierce. But even as he said it, he could feel the weight of what was coming, the law, the fight, the risk of losing her no matter what he chose. That night, long after she'd fallen asleep clutching her doll, Caleb sat by the dying fire, staring into the flames, his thoughts dark and restless. He'd already lost one family to sickness and silence. He wasn't about to lose another to lies and lawmen. As dawn crept pale over the plains, the decision settled in his chest like iron. If the world wanted to take Annie Mae Monroe, it was going to have to go through him first. The sky was the color of iron when Caleb Rollins rose before dawn, the kind of cold gray that promised a storm brewing somewhere beyond the ridge. He'd barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Annie's small face pressed against his chest, her trembling voice repeating that plea. "Please don't let him take me." It had gnawed at him through the long hours of the night until there was nothing left to do but decide. So as the first light crept weak and thin across the valley, he packed a saddlebag with the essentials, a bit of jerky, a flask of water, the folded note he'd left by Annie's bedside in case he didn't come back. He saddled his horse, Buck, slow and quiet so as not to wake her, though part of him wanted her to wake to see him go, to know he wasn't leaving out of fear but out of love. When he finally turned to the door, she stirred beneath the blanket, her small hand reaching out even in sleep. He paused long enough to brush a strand of hair from her face, whispering, "You hold tight, Annie Mae. I'll make it right." Then he slipped into the biting wind and rode toward town, the horizon darkening ahead of him as clouds gathered low and heavy, rolling in like judgment. Every hoofbeat sounded louder than the last, echoing through the hollow spaces of his heart. He'd thought once that courage meant standing alone, that a man's worth was measured by how long he could survive in silence. But as he rode through the growing wind, he realized he'd been wrong all these years. Courage wasn't about holding on to pain, it was about protecting what little light you found in a dark world, even when the cost was high. By the time he reached town, the storm had begun to break. Rain fell hard, washing the dust from the street and turning the ground to mud. Folks watched from under awnings as he dismounted outside the sheriff's office, his hat pulled low against the downpour. The door creaked when he pushed it open, water dripping from his coat onto the worn floorboards. The sheriff looked up from his desk, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Rollins," he said slowly. "Didn't expect to see you so soon." Caleb set his hat down, his voice steady but raw. "Didn't come to run. Came to speak my piece." The sheriff gestured for him to go on, but the other man, Silas Monroe, was already there, lounging in a chair by the stove, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You here to hand her over proper?" Silas asked. Caleb didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the lawman. "I found her half dead out by the old trail," he said. "She had no one. No food, no family, not a soul came looking. I gave her a roof, a bed, a life again. She's not blood, but she's mine just the same." His voice cracked, but he pressed on, the storm outside roaring like something alive. "That girl's got my heart, Sheriff, and I reckon that's worth something." The room went still, save for the hiss of rain against the windows. The sheriff leaned back, studying him, while Silas let out a harsh laugh. "Touchin'," he sneered. "But the law don't care for hearts." "Maybe not," Caleb said, turning toward him, his eyes hard as the storm. "But it ought to." He reached into his coat, pulled out the paper Silas had shown him before, and slammed it down on the desk. "That signature's forged. Ain't hard to tell. You want to check it, go ahead. I'll wait." The sheriff frowned, glancing over the page again, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. Outside, thunder rolled like distant gunfire. Caleb stood tall, unflinching, rainwater running down his face. "I've buried enough good people, Sheriff," he said quietly. "Not her. Not this time." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the lawman folded the paper, tucking it into his vest pocket. "I'll be looking into this," he said. "You've got my word." Caleb nodded once, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough for him to breathe. When he stepped back into the storm, the rain hit his face cold and sharp, but it felt clean somehow, like absolution. He mounted up, turned toward the ridge, and rode home through the downpour, every drop a prayer that the truth he'd spoken would be enough to keep the little girl who'd given him back his life. The storm had rolled on by morning, leaving the town washed clean beneath a pale stretch of sky that still smelled of rain and renewal. But Caleb Rollins didn't ride in that day to make trouble. He came because truth deserved to be seen in the open, not whispered in corners. When he reached Main Street, the ground was still slick with mud, and the townsfolk, drawn by curiosity or conscience, had already gathered outside the sheriff's office. Word had spread fast, too fast for comfort, and he could feel the weight of their eyes following him as he dismounted, his coat still damp from the night's ride. Inside, the sheriff stood behind his desk again, the same folded paper resting there like a loaded gun between them. But this time he wasn't alone. Silas Monroe leaned in the corner, arms crossed, smug as a man who thought the game was already won. "You're early, Rollins," he said, his grin all teeth. "Come to hand the girl over yourself?" Caleb didn't answer. He just removed his hat, rainwater dripping down his sleeve, and looked the sheriff square in the eye. "I came to tell the truth," he said simply. Nothing more, nothing less. But before the sheriff could speak, another voice cut in, soft but steady. "He's already told it, Sheriff." Miss Harland, the schoolteacher, stepped through the doorway, her shawl damp, her eyes fierce beneath the brim of her hat. "I've seen that man wait outside my schoolhouse every afternoon just to make sure Annie got home safe. I've seen her face light up when he's near. That's not something you fake." Behind her came the storekeeper, old Mr. Harper, wiping his hands on his apron as if the moment embarrassed him. "And I've seen 'em both in my store," he said gruffly. The girl was skin and bones when he first brought her in, couldn't hardly look anyone in the eye. Now she smiles like the sun's following her. A man don't bring that kind of light into a child's life unless he's honest. There was a murmur through the room then, and the door creaked again. The preacher entered next, tall and solemn, his worn Bible tucked beneath one arm. "The good book says, 'By their fruits ye shall know them,'" he said quietly. "I've seen the fruits of Mr. Rollins's labor, kindness, patience, and love. If that don't make him a father, I don't know what does." The sheriff looked between them all, his face unreadable as the air thickened with the sound of boots shifting and voices murmuring. Even Silas seemed to lose his footing for a moment, color rising to his cheeks as the room turned against him. "You people don't know nothin'," he spat. "She's my kin. My blood." "Your blood didn't feed her," Miss Harlan snapped. "Your blood didn't keep her alive through that storm." The preacher took a step closer, his gaze hard. "And your blood doesn't give you the right to take what God's already given another." Silas froze under the weight of it all, his bluster drying up in the face of so many eyes. The sheriff let the silence stretch, then finally reached down and picked up the folded paper, the one that had started all of this. He turned it over in his hands once, twice, then looked straight at Caleb. "You're a stubborn man, Rollins," he said, and there was something like a smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. "And maybe the law ain't always smart enough to see what's right. But I ain't blind, and I know the truth when it's standing in front of me." With that, he tore the paper clean in half. Then again, the sound sharp and final in the still air. He dropped the pieces into the stove, where they curled and blackened in the flames until they were nothing but ash. "Far as I'm concerned," he said, turning to Silas, "this matter's settled. You best ride on." Silas sputtered, his face red, but one look at the sheriff's hand resting on his holster was enough to send him storming out into the street, cursing under his breath. When the door swung shut, the room exhaled as if the whole town had been holding its breath. Caleb stood there, hat in hand, at a loss for words. The preacher nodded once, his voice soft. "Take that girl home, son. The Lord's done spoken." Outside, the air was warm and clear, sunlight spilling across the muddy street. As Caleb rode back toward the ridge, he saw Annie waiting on the porch, her red ribbon fluttering in the breeze. And when she spotted him, she ran down the path barefoot, laughing like she had no reason left to be afraid. And for the first time since the fever had taken everything from him, Caleb Rollins felt what it meant to be whole again. Spring came like a promise finally kept, soft and golden across the valley, turning the land from brown to life again. The snows that had once buried the fences melted into ribbons of water that ran down to the creek, feeding the grass until it shimmered like silk under the Sunday. For the first time in years, Caleb Rollins felt the world breathe easy, as if even the earth had been waiting for something worth waking to. The ranch, once half forgotten and worn thin by loneliness, was alive again, fences mended, roof patched, the smell of new hay rising from the barn. But the real change wasn't in the land. It was in the sound that carried across it the laughter of a little girl ringing out clear as birdsong, chasing away ghosts that had long made their home among the hills. Every morning, Annie was up before the rooster, her small boots thudding across the porch as she ran to the corral, where Buck waited patiently, as if he too had found joy in her company. Caleb taught her slow at first, guiding her hand to the reins, his rough voice steady and patient. She was small but fierce, gripping the saddle horn with all her might as he led the horse in lazy circles. "Don't fight him," he'd say, smiling despite himself. "You lead gentle, same way you'd want to be led." She'd nod solemnly, repeating his words like gospel, and before long, she was riding on her own, her laughter carried on the wind, wild and free. In the afternoons, he showed her how to mend a fence line, how to plant beans and squash in the neat rows by the cabin, how to tell the difference between good soil and bad just by the feel of it between her fingers. She soaked it all up like sunlight, every lesson, every story, every scrap of his hard-earned wisdom. There were moments when he'd catch her standing in the field, hair loose and shining, red ribbon fluttering in the breeze, and something in his chest would tighten something both tender and fierce. It wasn't the ache of grief anymore. It was the weight of love, unexpected and whole. One afternoon, as they worked side by side digging post holes, the air warm and sweet with the scent of blooming clover, Annie set down her spade and wiped the sweat from her brow. "Pa," she said suddenly, the words slipping from her lips as natural as breath. Caleb froze, the sound of it hitting him harder than any blow he'd ever taken. He turned slowly, his heart thundering in his chest. "What'd you say?" She looked up at him, unbothered, her face flushed and smiling. "I said, Pa. That's what you are, ain't it?" The world seemed to tilt for a moment, the sunlight blurring at the edges of his vision. He tried to speak, but his throat closed tight, the words catching somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. All he could manage was a rough, choked sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, he wasn't sure which. Annie tilted her head, a faint frown tugging at her lips. "You don't like it?" she asked softly. Caleb crouched beside her, rough hands trembling as he brushed the dirt from her sleeve. "I like it just fine," he managed, his voice breaking. "Just been a long time since I heard it." She grinned then, the kind of grin that could undo a man's whole world, and before he could stop her, she wrapped her arms around his neck, small but fierce, holding on like she'd never let go. He held her back, his eyes burning as he whispered, "You got no idea what that means, Annie Mae." The fields swayed around them in a lazy dance, the wind carrying the smell of lilac from the ridge, and the ranch, once a place of ghosts and silence, felt whole again. When the sun dipped behind the hills that evening, painting the sky in gold and fire, Caleb stood on the porch and watched her chase the chickens across the yard, her laughter rising and falling with the wind. And for the first time since he'd buried his wife and son, he whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, not for what he'd lost, but for what he'd been given back. The years slipped by like wind over the prairie, soft at first, then gone before a man could count them. And with each passing season, the Rawlins Ranch grew not just in size, but in spirit. The fences stood straight now, the fields rich with alfalfa and wheat, and the old barn that once leaned tired against the wind now gleamed red in the sun, its boards freshly painted by steady hands that had learned from the best. Annie Mae Rawlins, no longer the scared, barefoot girl Caleb had found crying by the fence, had grown into a woman with her mother's grace and her father's stubborn will, a figure of strength against the endless horizon. She rode tall in the saddle, commanding both horse and herd with the quiet authority that only came from a life earned the hard way. Her laugh still carried across the valley, though it was deeper now, threaded with the wisdom of years. And when the townsfolk saw her ride into market, head high, hat tipped low, they spoke her name with a kind of reverence, because they all knew the story that had made her who she was. They told it to their children and their children's children, the tale of Caleb Rawlins, the lonely rancher who once lived with nothing but ghosts and grief, until the day a small, broken voice called him back to life. They told how he'd taken in a girl no one else would claim, how he'd faced down the law, the town, even the storms themselves to keep her safe. And they said that from that day on, his cabin had never been silent again. Annie kept every piece of his world alive after he passed: the saddle he'd broken in his youth, the rifle he'd cleaned each night by the fire, the red ribbon she'd worn in her hair the day he taught her to ride. She buried him beneath the old cottonwood by the creek, the same place where he used to sit with her at dusk, pointing out the colors in the sky as the sun went down. On his headstone, she carved the words herself, steady and sure. He found family where the place is enlightening, world left none, and gave it roots to grow. Every evening, she still rode out there to watch the sunset the way he'd always loved, the orange light catching in her hair as the wind whispered through the grass. Sometimes she'd talk to him, telling him about the calves born that spring, the fence posts she'd replaced, or the way the neighbor's boy was trying too hard to impress her at church suppers. And sometimes, she just sat in silence, listening to the land breathe, knowing he was still there in every rustle of the wheat, every creak of the old barn, every heartbeat of the home he'd built. Folks who passed through the valley would often stop and ask who owned the spread up on the ridge, the one that bloomed every spring with wildflowers, the one where the fences never seemed to break. The locals would nod toward it and say, "That's the Rawlins place. Used to belong to a man named Caleb. Lonely sort, till the day kindness came knocking at his door." And those who lingered long enough might see the woman riding the perimeter at dusk, strong and sure, her silhouette golden against the dying light, her presence as steady as the land itself. They said the ranch was proof that love could grow out of the hardest ground, that redemption wasn't always found in churches or prayers, but in the quiet act of choosing to care when the world said it wasn't your burden to bear. And if you stood close enough to the cottonwood tree when the wind blew just right, you could almost hear a deep, warm laugh carried on the breeze, followed by a girl's voice, older now but still filled with light, answering back, "I stayed, Pa." And somewhere beyond the hills, the sun dipped low, painting the earth in gold, as the legacy of their love lived on, bright as the fire that had once saved them both.